In this episode of the Toolbox, I'm going to talk about what CSS, JavaScript, and new frameworks you should learn in 2022, plus sites you should know about, and I'll go over every new feature in Tailwind CSS. The pace of the web is relentless, and that's why you need the Toolbox. Hello everyone, this is Ray Villalobos, and I stream about front-end and full-stack tools Wednesday at 1 p.m., 10 a.m. 1 p.m. Eastern Time and 10 a.m. Pacific. So follow me and subscribe on all the social media things for more content. Now, if you want to watch any past episodes, make sure you take a look at my blog, raybo.org. So a big part of my job is to try and stay on top of new technologies for web developers. And so far I've done 16 episodes of the Toolbox, and I have to admit that I had no idea how deep the rabbit hole of learning was. So what I wanted to do this year in the Toolbox is to give you a show that helps you stay up to date. So I'll be covering all the new frameworks, JavaScript and CSS Trends, and also interviewing some of the people who do the work. So you can spend about an hour learning each week, and I'll try to keep you up to date with what's going on in the world of the web. In the live show, I'll let you ask questions, but you can catch the shows later on your own time if it doesn't work for your schedule. So let's begin with something I call the bits. And these are just sites that I found really useful recently. Now these are going to relate to the topic that I'm covering today. So you can find all these in the short section of raybo.org as well. So let me go to my side-by-side view here. And here is my website, which is raybo.org. So there's a section called Shorts. And you can also click right here and do a search for anything you want, and it'll give you a little drop down with whatever I'm talking about today will eventually make it onto the website. So there's also a section right here for the Toolbox, and you can catch the previous episodes right here. And if you want to look at, say, the videos or the courses that I'm working on, you can take a look at the courses section and all that good stuff. So before we begin, I wanted to sort of cover something that I covered in the previous episode, which was the state of CSS, because one of the things that I do with my sort of learning is to take a look every year at two really important polls. One of them is this poll called the State of CSS survey. So you may have heard of it once a year, and this one just released. So it's already closed, but it released in December. And so what this does is show you the things that are sort of trending in CSS, and the poll lets you sort of take an account of how well you understand some of these new features. So it's a really good way to be able to tell where you're at with the rest of the world. The interesting thing is once the poll releases, then you can take a look at things like technologies or features and see how well you're doing or how well those features are doing historically. So what I like here is to look at something, for example, like CSS Grid. It shows you that this year versus last year, it has gathered a lot more acceptance. Same thing with Flexbox. It's just ridiculous. 98% or 99% almost of people said that they were already using Flexbox. So I like to go to this survey to understand where I'm at, what things I need to learn, whether or not some of these things are being adopted by the community. So it's really something for you to take a look at, even if you even if you think you know, or like you're trying to keep up with everything. This really shows you sort of the, a really good look at how well and the rest of the world is doing. So you can also break it down by layout, and you can see each one of the different features and also the historical data. So far they've run this for about 3 years, and every year you can see that, for example, something like CSS Grid, when they first started out, about half of the people understood this or had used it. A lot of people knew about it, but they hadn't really used it. So you can see that the trend is for this to be pretty much heavily accepted into the world. So if you are trying to figure out what should I learn this year, this is a good place to go. And it is showing you that something like CSS Grid is something that you should be already familiar with. So actually, I think this needs to be a little bit smaller here. So if we take a look at some of the features, and I'm starting with actually, let me go through some of the other tools that I use. So in addition to the State of CSS, there's also a site called State of JS, and the URL for the State of CSS is 2021, so the year, .stateofcss.com. And then there's another one called the State of JS, so 2020. This one's a little bit older, but it also has a lot more data. So I think it's like 14,000 respondents for the State of JS and about 8,000 for the State of CSS. And this is going to show you trends. It's not perfect, but you know, all data is good data to me. So this one shows you what's happening with JavaScript. And in here, you do want to take a look at technologies and see if maybe you missed some things. So here are changes over time of some of the different frameworks. So again, I go through this a lot. Now, another website, or the last website that I want to show you, and I usually go through a lot of cool websites at the beginning of the episodes, is this website called proposals.es. Now, this shows you all of the latest features of JavaScript. Year by year, JavaScript is like on an annual release schedule, and every year they say this is, and it's called ES because it's ECMAScript. Technically, that's what JavaScript is called. And so you can see the proposals of what is coming up. And this is a good place to go if you're interested in figuring it out, if you already know some of these features, if you're comfortable with them. And here you can tell, you can look at something like optional chaining, right? And take a look at some examples of the code and also some of the documentation regarding this particular feature. Now, when you see the homepage for this, you'll see that this it divides everything into different stages. So you could read more about the stages here. Stage 4 means that it is already finished and accepted into the language. So it's something that you should kind of put on your radar if you don't know about some of these things to learn during the year. So stage 3 means that they are candidates for release maybe in 2022 or 2023. And you know, all the different stages mean different sort of levels of sort of ready to go on the browsers, even though some of the browsers may not have all these features. Always go to caniuse.com, and in that site you can type in any feature like async. Maybe it's pulling up asynchronous clipboard, but async function, so you can see how well it is accepted into your current browser that you're looking at. So if you take a look at the features here, you'll notice that there's a lot of proposals in this section that you know, you may not know about. So just sort of keep up with what's going on in there. So I want to actually go back into some of the things that happen in the world of the web. And I'm going to begin, or I'm going to go back to CSS to show you what's happening in the world, especially of CSS and some of the frameworks. And I like that this State of the Web survey is giving you sort of a graph that tells you what's happening. I don't think it's had enough data to do something historical, but it kind of shows you what the trends are and where things are going. So as you can see, for example, that Sass, it's still super popular in the world of the web. So, you know, you have to sort of detach yourself from the fact that when you look at a lot of tutorials, people are always covering like the bleeding edge. You don't necessarily you're not necessarily going to be using that in your day-to-day work. Maybe you're still using Sass, but you want to sort of take a look at what is trending. And one of the things that is, you know, CSS is actually the fastest of all of the languages, much more so than JavaScript. So whereas JavaScript is getting more incremental changes, CSS is seeing a lot of a lot of new features that you may have missed, and so you do want to take a look at some of those. But here you can see things like frameworks and which ones are doing pretty well, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. So if you look at this CSS survey, you'll notice that the big news, as I mentioned before, if we go to technologies, is that, let's see, CSS Grid. So let's see, I need to go to, let's see, features right here in layout. In the layout section, you can see that this is the year that I think CSS Grid really broke out. It's really well understood, or at least well used by a lot of people, even if it's just a little bit. I mean, you can use grid in very simple ways. So this is definitely a technology that I think you should focus on. And if you look at some of the upcoming features that maybe are not something that you're familiar with, there's this thing called subgrid, which is still in development, but it's something that I wouldn't necessarily worry about this right now, but something to keep an eye on, because subgrid lets you essentially break down the grid into additional sections. Now you can see that people are incredibly comfortable with Flexbox, more than probably anything else in here, that it has like almost 100% acceptance rate compared to some of the other features. So that's, if you haven't, you know, I wouldn't almost can't believe you haven't used Flexbox. I mean, evidently everybody has. So make sure that you're really comfortable with Flexbox, but start investing a little bit of time on to CSS Grid. There's a lot of other features here. And there's things that you can see, like, for example, this multi-column format. So the ability to create columns is something that I believe we had a long time ago, but somehow I don't know how it dropped off of the world, but it's coming back, and it's something that a lot of people haven't used. So essentially kind of like a magazine layout. And when I do the demo of Tailwind, you'll see that it has the potential of adding that with some additional features. So I like some of this other features here. Writing modes is something that you're seeing appear in a lot of frameworks. So Bootstrap, for example, has the ability to display text as right to left or left to right for some languages that are defined in that way. So although a lot of people haven't really used this, I think that this is a feature that you're going to see push more and more in the industry, and you should be pretty comfortable with. And it's not really that difficult to implement, especially when some of the frameworks already use it. So I love this. Look how position sticky, the ability to stick into certain parts of the scrolling. And you'll see an example in the Tailwinds demo as well of how that works. And other things that I like is things like logical properties. So the ability to use things like variables and sort of simple formulas. I did a previous demo on something called calc that I really love, and you should definitely go watch that. It's an amazing feature that helps you create font sizes in a way that you're not going to want to do them any other way after that. So another thing that's getting a lot of press, so aspect ratio, I love. So this is the ability of defining like a video. So you have a video on your page and it displays in a hard-coded format. So it's like an iframe and it comes with a size. So aspect ratio just allows you to display the video in like a 16:9 format. So this is a really good tag that I think you're gonna love. So even though a lot of people haven't used it, I'm gonna go into it, get into it. And all these things have additional ways to look at the data. Also direct links to can I use. So if you're curious, should I be using this aspect ratio, just click right there and you'll see that it takes you directly there. It's pretty well supported so far, definitely not in IE. So if you have to target IE, then you don't want to be doing this, or you want to have a fallback at least for IE. So let's see some of the other features that I love this gap feature. It's pretty good. So you can actually control like you create a Bootstrap set of columns, you can easily in Flexbox and Grid control the spacing in between the columns, which is really great. Another one of those that I think they're so amazing that you're going to want to use them immediately. So there's stuff like break rules, like how the break character kind of affects the flow of the content. This is one that's getting a ton of attention. So container queries essentially allow you, this is a feature, first of all, that's in flux. So it's been getting a lot of updates, and so it may not be something that you want to use maybe quite yet in production. I'm not sure of the status. I would click on can I use, but you're going to see a lot of videos about this thing in the next year. So a lot of times when you're doing responsive design, you always, sort of set breakpoints for the width of the viewport or the size of your device. Well, sometimes like the content or the space that the content has to display things, sort of you want to do different things depending on the available space for the container. So this allows you to create queries or media queries depending on the width of the available space for the items. So it's a really, really cool feature. And I think that's something that you're definitely going to love. And there's also all of these section right here called shapes and graphics. So we finally have the ability to create geometric shapes in CSS and a lot of other cool stuff like clipping paths, masks, filters, blend modes. So all these different filters, effects. This is really going to change the layouts that you're going to see on websites. So if you're a web designer, you definitely want to experiment with these features because they're going to make your layouts stand out and make you very marketable in the future. Another feature that I totally love is this really small feature called object fit. So if you've been doing CSS for a while, you know that you've had the ability of using background images and making them fit proportionally within a specific size. Well, object fit allows you to do that with just regular images. So you can specify a size and ask that image to fit within that content, just like you did, or just like you do with backgrounds. So I love this feature. I'm already using it, and you can see that people are really warming up to it. So this is definitely one that I would spend some time with if you haven't already. There's a lot of interesting other features here. So for example, there's one called intrinsic sizing that is also kind of interesting. It lets you take into account the space that the text has to display items. I don't know where. It might not be in this section. I don't know if I saw it earlier. It might be in shapes and graphics or one of these other places, but so that's a pretty cool feature, intrinsic sizing. So make sure you check that out if you haven't already. And as I mentioned, object fit is probably like my favorite thing that they have added. A lot of cool features, but these are probably the ones that I would focus on if you haven't already, if you haven't learned them. I would definitely play around, especially I think like the shapes and the filters. It's almost like they've given us Photoshop for the web now. So we can do these crazy layouts with all kinds of interesting sort of, classes that we can use in our designs. So, all right, so let's talk a little bit about CSS frameworks. A lot of things are happening in the world of frameworks. So when we went to features, you saw that there's all these frameworks on the web, and frameworks try to make your life easier by giving you all these features if you adhere to a certain format of writing your code. So a good example of that would be Bootstrap. They give you a lot of things like modals and buttons and the carousel, lots of things and a few classes that you can use in order to use those. A lot of interesting things are happening in the world of frameworks. Sass is still heavily used everywhere, but most of its features are being now imported and added into regular CSS. So at some point you're going to have to, if you're like a heavy Sass user, I would make sure that I'm trying some of these out, understand variables, and know that the world is making a shift to that. Now, Bootstrap is still incredibly popular, and I really love it. But things like Tailwind CSS, as well as Windy CSS, and others are starting to really nip at the heels of something like Bootstrap. So you really want to sort of make that transition this year, if you haven't already, into regular CSS. So Tailwind is really becoming the de facto standard for component-based architectures. If you're using things like React, Vue, or Svelte, you really want to be using those with Tailwind CSS. It has something called a utility-based approach that is far superior when working with those frameworks. And again, I'll do a demo of it later on. If you now, it's not for everything. So Tailwind, as much press as it's getting, it's not for everything. It doesn't have any of the Bootstrap components. So you'll see when I do the demo that if you are trying to create a button, you have to actually write like a bunch of classes just to get like a single button. And if you're reusing that button over and over in your code, it's a little bit of a pain. There's some ways around it, but I would not do or use Tailwinds if I wasn't using a component-based architecture. So a couple of other interesting things are happening in there as well. I've covered Tailwind as well as something called Windy CSS. Windy is sort of like a Tailwind clone. And let's see, I think I have some samples here. So this is actually, when you click on some of these things, you can look at some of the examples that MDN has. So there's object fit, my favorite feature. You can see that when I click on these different items, it shows you that you could just take a single image and control how it displays on its container. So a couple of really interesting things that have been happening is the development of a few related frameworks. So Windy CSS is a Tailwind clone. I covered it in previous episode, and it was first to adopt this new approach that Tailwind CSS 3 is doing called the just-in-time approach. So basically, it lets you sort of output CSS for your final build that is only the CSS that you're using in your project. So when you import something like Bootstrap, regardless of what you're doing, you're importing a ton of stuff. Whether or not you're using it, you're importing all the buttons, everything else. There's ways around that, but basically you're importing everything. So Tailwind and Windy just allow you to output just what you need. So this is a pretty interesting framework. I wouldn't worry too much about it because Tailwind 3 has actually caught up to what Windy CSS was doing. So much so that the developer of this framework went to work on something called Uno CSS. So I think I have so here's Uno CSS, and it's a atomic CSS framework that actually claims to be 200 times faster than Tailwind's. So I wouldn't necessarily worry about these emerging frameworks too much, but I want to give you an idea of where CSS is going in the future. Tailwinds proved that the utility-based approach was really powerful. So there's all these other frameworks that are coming up. And I haven't covered Uno in a previous episode, but I covered another framework called Assembler CSS. Which is really odd, but it's indicative of where I think CSS frameworks are going. So Assembler, and I do have an episode on this, essentially takes the Tailwind CSS approach and lets you create everything but using CSS variables instead of what Tailwind is doing. So interesting experiment. I think that things, especially component-based items, are moving to this utility-based approach. That's why Tailwind is just like exploding in popularity. So you should sort of definitely look at Tailwind this next year. You should definitely maybe explore some of these things. And this is kind of my goal with the toolbox each week. I want to kind of show you these things, show you how they work. And if you look at the previous episodes, you'll know that I try to give you like a little practical exercise that you can do if you want to just learn the thing without spending too much time on it, or just let me sort of spend the time doing it. So, okay, before we talk into JavaScript, let me see if I have any questions in the chat. So I have a lot of hellos. Yeah, so it's super cool. I think I have like right now 42 live viewers on LinkedIn, just on LinkedIn. So super cool. Let's see, I think if I hit it, no, yeah. So yeah, I started learning web development. Guys, you want to give me suggestions? Yeah, so stay tuned to the toolbox. That's really my goal next year. Yeah, you can ask questions. I am going to sort of take little breaks to answer them. I have a lot of content. So yeah, absolutely ask questions and just I'm going to try to make sure that I take breaks, but I'm talking and I'm like a one-person show here. So I'm doing all of the, sort of clicking around on things. Cool. Yeah, there's going to be a recording available. Actually, I need to scroll back to see what everybody's asking in the order. So let's see. Excited about this session. That's pretty cool. And yeah, please ask me questions. I love when people ask questions. And this is the time if you've been holding have some thoughts and you want to ask them, this is the time to do it now before I move on to sort of the next subsection. So grid, Andrew loves grid. It's crazy powerful. I've had mixed feelings with grid because I got so used to Flexbox, and I think this has kind of happened in the industry. It feels like a little bit like math, but you could definitely do some incredibly powerful layouts that are just not possible with anything else. So definitely need to be something everybody tries to learn this next year. So yeah, awesome. Thank you, Andrew, for putting the URLs. I appreciate that. So I'll try to mention them, and oftentimes I actually put them all in the show. But again, I'm like a one-person show, and a lot of times I'm like doing things up to the last minute. So yes, Leah, definitely the videos get recorded. I have a YouTube channel. So youtube.com/planet of the web, and they get recorded. If you are in LinkedIn, then on the homepage, you should see a sidebar that has all the events that you attended to or that you signed up for. So you should see this show there in that list as well. So it's an easy way to get to this particular episode. If you want to see any other episodes, make sure you check rabo.org, check my YouTube channel, like and subscribe everywhere. It really helps me out. So let's see. And look, my other friends are here. A lot of friends are here. Daniel Crenshaw. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, thank you for sharing their links. I really do appreciate that. In a perfect world, I would have like a producer actually helping me out, but I'm trying to do a lot of things all at the same time. So let's see. Hello. What is the future of React Native? Okay, that's an interesting question. I think React and React Native appear to be merging a little bit recently. Like they're trying to become just one thing. And I was reading an article that mentioned that it was sort of never their intention for them to be completely separate things, that they really intended them to become sort of a single product. So that was an interesting sort of tidbit that I learned. Hello, Rachel. How's it going? Wow, that's cool. Rachel is really awesome, so it's good to see her around. Let's see, great catch up. Oh yeah, there's a lot of really cool stuff, and honestly, it's kind of like my job to keep up with everything. Sort of a crazy job, but I really this is the fun part of my job. So any tricks or suggestions for Google SketchUp I don't really do a lot of, I do love SketchUp. So one time I had an office and I needed to fit like this crazy amount of stuff in the office. So I used like SketchUp to like 3D model like my office, and it worked like a charm. But I'm not really that familiar with it, honestly, to give a lot of tips on it. We definitely have some courses on that as well. So what are the best way to get inspiration for designing a web page? I think that just honestly look for sites that you really love and try to keep like a clipboard of things that you like. So if you see a site that you like, take a quick screenshot and just keep it around. I always begin my design projects by inspiration, or you could just keep it as a bookmark link. So it's good to sort of, before you begin a project, look at a lot of things that you love, and you'll find that actually feeds your soul and helps you design something that's maybe completely new, but it's kind of inspired by those things. I used to think that was sort of cheating until I used to work at a newspaper, and I saw that that's exactly what all of the extremely good artists used to do. Whenever they had to draw somebody or the likeness of somebody in their own unique style, they would have like 100 pictures of the person in different styles. They would just do a lot of research and get inspired, and then they would create something that was unique and in their own style. So I think that's the best thing that you can do. Just go find things. Every time you see something cool, bookmark it. And then, when you are ready to design something, just get inspired by what you've seen before, and sometimes you can try to copy things. What they say, like good artist copies, great artist steal. And you'll find that even when you're trying to copy, something in you will make you create your own version of it. So that's what's really cool about whenever I try to copy something, I can't just copy it. It always ends up to that I end up designing something that is maybe inspired by something else. So that's a good tip. Grid. There's a lot of grid generators. I've covered some of those in the show before. So yeah. So Daniel's giving a good tip. So grid layout. That's a good tip. There's a lot of also frameworks that are based on something like Tailwind, and other frameworks as well. So React is standing on its own as that's a good tip. So React is standing on its own as a UI renderer. Yeah, React is one of the things that I was going to say later on is that React is really what I would learn today. So lots of hello. Let's see, vanilla JavaScript. So JavaScript, React Native would be a good learning path. Definitely put CSS in there. Clearly HTML, like know the basics, a lot of JavaScript, and then move on to React. I mean, React is the one thing I would learn if I had only to learn one thing. Flutter gonna replace React Native? I don't think so. Flutter's a pretty good project, but React Native is pretty cool too. So I think a lot of what you should look for me, like the way that I learn things is I try to look for trends and not worry so much about the specific frameworks, but think about what they are attempting to do. So with CSS Frameworks, what you're seeing is that you're seeing a move towards utility-based sort of approaches, especially for component-based architectures like React, Vue, Angular. So that is a definite trend. And so you're seeing a lot of experimentation. So if you look at Assembler CSS, or if you look at Windy CSS, or you look at Uno, they're all trying to figure out, is there a way to make this utility-based approach a little bit better? So if you learn one of them, you'll be, I think, sort of set up for the rest of them. And so I'm trying to give you every week like a little bit of a demo of those things so that you'll get an idea of, okay, this is what this is about. This is how it works. Dude, that's nuts. Like a lot of times when you go look at something like Assembler, you're like, what the heck is this even about? And but a lot of times I think it's good to like look at them so that they can like reset your mind, because otherwise you're not going to be able to sort of open up your mind to like explore some of these new ideas. So interesting. Which web dev languages are leading fields? So I have some stuff to talk about that later on, so I'm going to leave that one open. So the emphasis is increasingly on React Native, React DOM, React whatever, different ways for React to interact with all the platforms. So yeah, the React, it feels a little bit maybe like Angular. Like Angular eventually became more of a platform, so React feels like it's kind of maybe going in that direction. So the best framework. So yeah, definitely keep watching, because I'm going to talk about the JavaScript frameworks themselves. So yeah, let's see. Yeah, some really good points from Rachel. So we tend to confuse React with React DOM, but React is increasingly platform agnostic. So cool stuff. Wow, lots of awesome stuff in there in the comments. So I appreciate that. Let's see. So let me close this out and keep going. So let's talk about JavaScript. Let's see. Do I have... so here, this year, like every year, all the main frameworks release new versions of their platforms. So things like React, Vue.js and Angular are on continuous updates. So you should definitely, if you're not familiar with one of those, as I already mentioned, I would definitely learn React. It is so dominant in the industry. There are some things and some new approaches that I'll show you in a minute that I think are challenging some of what React is doing, but React does a great job at evolving the framework. But before we get into React, let's discuss some of the features that you should know of just plain JavaScript. So if we take a look at that ES Proposals website, you can see that there's a lot of sort of functionality that they have added in stage 4. A lot of them are very little. So there's a lot of these whole series of operators that you should learn about. Like optional chaining is like an operator that you can use that makes it easier for querying for data and letting you sort of know, whether or not that retrieval is null, or that if it has a value. So this is kind of a minor update. And there's actually a lot of really small, tiny operators that are going to make your life easy in the future. But the things that you should really be comfortable with are something like async await. That makes the execution of code more predictable. So to understand that, you actually need to also have a good understanding of promises. So I would make sure that I learn a little bit about sort of the way that try catch in JavaScript attempts to show you how to manage errors, and then learn about promises because they're kind of related, and then learn about async and await. And I have a shameless plug. I actually did a brand new course called JavaScript as a Second Language. So this is a new course, and it's actually covering a lot of these concepts. This is why I'm bringing it up. So it goes through try catch here. Then it has a section on things like transpiling, the spread syntax. And I really had a ton of fun with this course. And it has like this cool music. And it uses examples that I think are fun and sort of practical to show you some of these features. I sort of, when I was thinking about this course, I was trying to figure out, I was thinking about how I learned English as a second language, and that's why it's called JavaScript as a second language. The fact that when you learn a second language, you kind of learn it in context. Like, you learn what words mean based on how people are using them. So I wanted to create a course that had that same kind of feeling. Like, I'm going to show you this maybe semi-complicated feature, like say promises, but I'm going to use an example that will make it a little bit more clear. So in this course, like, I take something like promises and I walk you through what they are, sort of the code for them sometimes, and then I kind of try to bring an example. So in this case, we're building like this application for a trainer that is taking somebody through taking some dogs through a course, a training course. So that's the approach. I had a lot of fun, and it's a brand new course that just released like last week, and I'm really excited about it. So I hope you take the time to watch that. I'm super psyched because this is the kind of stuff that I've always wanted to do, but they would never let me do. So I finally got the chance to do a course on this, and I think it does cover a lot of these things. And if you guys do like it, so make sure you give it a review. Then hopefully they'll let me do more of these, because I would really like to do more with graphics and more with these kind of examples that we don't always get to work with. So definitely, as I mentioned, async functions are great. REST spreads properties are pretty awesome. You need to have a good understanding of async await, promises, and all those things if you haven't had that already. Now, the real action in JavaScript is happening in the framework front. So there's, of course, the three big frameworks that I already mentioned, React, Angular, and Vue.js. Now, if I was looking for a job right now, I would definitely just learn React. It's just so dominant in the industry. And it's also, they do an amazing job of constantly evolving the platform. So if you're looking for a job, this is the most marketable skill out there right now. However, if I was building a personal project, I would probably go for Vue.js. Also, it's a great framework for somebody who is just starting out. It's really, I consider it my favorite framework. It's very easy to learn, and it just immediately, if you know JavaScript, it makes a ton of sense. So it is a lot of fun. The fact that you can use it just by adding a simple script tag is also pretty slick. Now, Angular as a framework is still around, but it just doesn't, it's not gaining like a lot of popularity. You might still find companies that use it. So I would say if you're trying to figure out what to learn next year, go find some companies where you'll want to work and try to find out, you can do a search on LinkedIn or anywhere else for what requirements certain companies have for working there. And a lot of times you'll see that it is regional. So depending on where you are in the world, you'll need to learn some of these and not other ones. Now, if you're itching to try something new, you should definitely try this framework called Svelte. Now, this is really a weird new approach. Svelte gets rid of the killer feature in React and Vue, the virtual DOM. Now, the virtual DOM makes things easier, and what it does is essentially it lets you manage takes care of managing the DOM by just looking at the state of your data and then automatically taking care of what's happening in the front end. So I think that the problem with the virtual DOM is that it does all that at a performance cost. So the killer app or the killer feature of Svelte is that it precompiles the code so that in most instances you don't really have to have the virtual DOM. Now, I think that Svelte is going to have a breakthrough year this year, and that's because Vercel, which is one of the top companies in the industry, hired the creator, Rich Harris of Svelte. So far, Svelte has been a project that Rich was working for the New York Times. That's his full-time job. So Svelte was a project that he developed on his free time. Like I don't know how people can do that. But of course, he has a big team now around it. But now, since Vercel hired him, he can focus 100% of his time on Svelte. So that's pretty awesome. So as amazing as Svelte is, up to now, it's been a part of what he did on his free time. So that is definitely, I think, something that has the potential of having a breakthrough year. And that's because Vercel bought them. I think he's going to have a lot more time to experiment. They did a new version of Svelte called like Svelte 3D, or it's like a 3D sort of version of Svelte. So definitely, I mean, I don't know if people have like a time TARDIS or something that they can use to create like infinite amounts of time. But if that's what Rich was doing with his free time, I can't wait to see what he does with unlimited, like if focusing on the specific framework. So I have to do a couple of honorary mentions on other little frameworks that I love. So I'm going to bring up Alpine.js. This is a really fun, small JavaScript framework that is super easy to learn. So it feels like a version of jQuery. Like, remember when jQuery used to be cool and fun? Alpine.js feels like that. What I love about it is that it only has 15 attributes, 6 properties, and 2 methods to learn. So it's super easy to learn. I did do an app demo of this on a previous episode. So it's easy to pick up, and it feels like a lot of fun. If I was doing something kind of quick, then I would definitely pick this up, and it's super easy to learn. Now, the other thing that's really happening in the world of the web is the rise of something I call the meta frameworks. So these are frameworks that aren't frameworks in themselves, but use other frameworks, if that makes sense. And of course, the top one in the field is the one called Astra, which everyone seems to be talking about. Astra is still under heavy development, and I did do a demo of this in, I think, the previous, like 2 episodes ago. So make sure you check that out. Everybody's super exciting. The main features that this has is something called partial hydration. So the cool killer feature, or one of the cool killer features, is that it'll load JavaScript only when you need it. So if you have a carousel that is like, in the middle of your page, it's not going to load the JavaScript for that carousel until you scroll to that section, if you set it up that way. The other thing is that you could use any framework with this framework. And if you look at the demo that I did, it's actually pretty awesome the way that you can create websites using embedded JavaScript that essentially, if you've used something like Eleventy, at the very top of any of those Eleventy, you have some sort of metadata that sets things up so that when everything gets processed into a static site, that it looks at whatever's in that metadata and then it compiles it. Well, this allows you to do things like put JavaScript, retrieve data, and then precompile all that into some content. So it's pretty amazing. Everybody is really excited about this framework. It's getting a lot of attention. So if I was going to spend some time with it, just go watch my demo, and I think you'll get a kick out of it. It's still under flux, so definitely not something that you have to learn, but I think this is going to be a breakout technology coming up in 2022. The other thing that I've noticed is that there's a couple of other new frameworks. So mainly, there's one called Hydrogen, so by the developers of Shopify. The trend that I'm seeing on frameworks is that things started out with things like with technologies like PHP, and then they moved on to sort of dynamic single page applications. Then you moved on to serverless, where everything was kind of precompiled. And the truth is that precompiling things or just compiling things are things that are better handled on a server. Rendering things is what servers are really good at. So I see an attempt to actually move some of the work that we've been doing locally, or perhaps in something like GitHub Actions, back onto the server. And it makes a lot of sense because servers are good at that kind of stuff. They're also good at caching things. So one of the problems that I have with like, with my personal website is that I use 11T, so I have to pre-render everything. I'll check on the time. Wow. I have to pre-render everything, and every time I go like write an article, I have to, it lets me know that, oh, this version of SAS is now updated, or 11T is now at a dot upgrade. So I have to worry about a lot of that sort of thing. Those things are, I think, sometimes better handled in the server. Also, the pre-rendering, the servers are going to be much faster at doing that. And it also can cache things. And you're going to see a movement towards something that is known as edge computing. So when you request, a site, the servers that can cache things that are closer to the user that is requesting them. So if you're requesting something and you're the only person, right, getting the data for a certain number of pages, then the cache that is closest to you is the one that the servers will be able to create. So somebody in California is not going to get some CDN content that is cached basically to you. You're going to get the closest, fastest version of that. So we're moving away from, not away from serverless, but we're moving like the serverless part of the thing back to the servers, if that makes sense. That's definitely a trend, and I'm seeing it in a framework like Hydrogen, which is by Shopify, and the other big name in this is one called Remix. So Remix does essentially that. Remix used to be a React router, and so now they have made it its own framework, and basically what it's trying to do is move things back onto the server, honestly, where they've always belonged. I was never 100% sold on serverless because you still needed some sort of server and the caching and all that stuff. I mean, we saw like different ways of trying to get around the fact that all sites really have to be dynamic in some way, or most sites have to be dynamic in some ways. So we're seeing that sort of move back. Okay, honorable mentions to some things that I think are going to be becoming pretty dominant. A couple of things are, number one, Vite. So Vite is, everybody still needs build tools in order to manage the process of, modifying your code and converting it to something usable by the browser. There have been a lot of great things in the past, things like Grunt, Gulp, Webpack, Snowpack. I'm seeing Vite be the dominant sort of platform for build processes. And a lot of these tools that I'm talking about have actually moved into Vite. I keep on saying this, but I did do a demo of this. So make sure you check it out, how you put a project together and some of the features that it has. So it's made by the creators of Vue.js. It's pretty awesome stuff. All right, so finally, I have seen also in the future, or lately, I've seen a lot of stuff move to the Rust programming language. So this isn't JavaScript, but a lot of things that are performance heavy, pieces of frameworks are moving into this separate language that will compile into JavaScript and have some better features like memory management, reliability. I think they tout that they are really good at embedded devices, so devices that don't have a lot of processing power. Not too familiar with it, but I'm seeing it appear more and more so. I think that's definitely a trend. So let me take a break and take a look at some of the comments before I go on to my Tailwind demo, although we're like really tight on time. So, oh look, the one is being awesome in finding some answers for people. So courses on, somebody was asking about SketchUp. So people are, that's great. Thank you, D. Let's see. What are the best frameworks? Yeah, so this is the best frameworks to learn. I think I just mentioned them. Let's see. Okay, lots of other cool comments. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Rachel. Rachel is somebody that I've known for quite a while and somebody who I really admire. So I appreciate that. That's great. Try this so there's a lot of also course recommendations. So make sure you check that out. Wow, a lot of good stuff happening on the chat. So let me take a look. Love Vue, very simple. Yes, another Vue person like me. I mean, I love React. Some of the way that you write, like the HTML drives me crazy still. And like when I use Vue, I just immediately got it. So nothing to dog React. I mean, it's so amazing at keeping up. And, you're seeing a lot of these features coming back into some of these languages as well. I think everything is sort of becoming like almost like a single mind language. Languages are learning from each other and adopting some of these features. So I think any of those features, any of those frameworks would be great. So, okay, so that's pretty much it for comments. Let me keep on going. I don't know why my camera appears to be freaking out, so forgive me. Okay, so let's keep going with what we have going on. And so it's a Tailwind CSS demo. So let's get to that. Tailwind CSS is a new version of this like utility based framework. So that really shook the web. So somewhere around here I have, yeah, here we go, Tailwind CSS. So let me just play you the demo, and hopefully my camera will stop shaking, and we'll get back into things. Early in December 2021, Tailwind CSS released version 3.0 of its framework. The main changes in this version had been pioneered since version 2.1. Now, before we go over the specifics, let's take a look at how it works and what makes it a compelling option for component-based architectures. Tailwind CSS is known as a utility-first CSS framework. And one of the reasons behind it is that best practices don't actually work. So let me show you an example of why that's the case. My website, rabo.org, was built with Bootstrap and Eleventy. I'm going to scroll down to one of my pages, and then once I'm on this page, I'm going to right-click on this headline and select Inspect. On the left-hand side, you can see the HTML for this page. In the middle, you can see what we call the cascade, the C and CSS. Notice that in order to display this headline, the browser is gathering styles from different places. It's grabbing certain styles from a file called overrides.scss and some things from another style called reboot. If you scroll down, you can see that there is a third part called the user agent. Now, these are styles that the browsers create. And then some stuff is inherited from other places. Now, on the right-hand side, you can see the results of the cascade. So just to display this headline, the browser has to worry about the class that contains it, as well as the container for that, which is main content, and then also what's happening in these classes in the body section, as well as any browser defaults and any resets that Bootstrap is doing. Not only that, but even when doing a simple page like this, we end up writing styles that override what different things are already doing. As our CSS grows, those overrides get more and more complicated. So the utility-based approach lets you more explicitly define what you're doing and never worry about the styles affecting your current element. I know it sounds crazy, but it works really well. There's a few places where something like Bootstrap is superior. Tailwind CSS is just that, a CSS framework. Bootstrap, however, provides a lot more functionality. It has a rich set of components. So you have accordions, buttons, drop-downs, modals, pagination, all these things that are pre-built for you. That sort of thing is a lot more difficult to do in Tailwind because you have to specify styles for each one of those components. So in Tailwind, you end up with really scary styles for things like a button. Tailwind CSS is much better at working with component-based architectures like React, Vue, and Angular. It's really not that great if you want to use the same styles over and over in your HTML. But in a component-based architecture, every one of those elements is usually separated into an individual component. Now, it does provide this apply directive so that you can extract repeated utility patterns and create your own repeatable styles, but you have to do that manually. One huge advantage over Bootstrap is that Tailwind only ships the CSS that you need for your project. And most Tailwind projects will ship with less than 10 kilobytes of CSS to the client. Now, that does mean that you need to have a build process. So it's not as easy to work with as something like Bootstrap, where you just import a CSS style sheet into your project. Let's take a look at some of those new features. Now, they have a pretty cool video that explains a lot of the new features. First is the just-in-time engine. Now, this has actually been around since version 2.1. So let's dig into why that's such a powerful feature. Now, Tailwind CSS provides you clones of regular CSS classes. So for example, if we take a look at something like the display classes, it's just a series of shortcuts for the existing CSS classes. And you can see that for floats, it's just cloning the CSS classes as well. Now, it also has a lot of additional classes. So for example, if we look at colors, you'll notice that it has an extremely rich amount of colors. In older versions of Tailwind, to keep things small, it would only ship a certain number of the colors. Because it's shipping only what you need, they've turned on the ability to refer to any of the colors. Now that's really important when you start using a lot of the interactivity features. So if you add, for example, a hover class to your background colors so that when you roll over it, you get a different color, you now have a main class plus a hover class for every one of the colors that the framework would ship with. That would originally make for a humongous CSS file, but with the just-in-time compiler, it's only going to ship what you're using. So where in older versions, certain parts of the framework were turned off, now everything is on and available to you. JIT also gives you the option of creating your own custom classes. So here, for example, you can see how with brackets, we can create a size that doesn't exist. Or we can add a custom background color to an element. This is like using the style attribute, but you have the advantage of having access to all the modifiers that Tailwind comes with. There are some truly new features. So for example, you now have the ability to use colored box shadows. There are some different shadow sizes. So first you have to specify a shadow and then a size. In this case, we're using the large shadow. Then to specify the color of the drop shadow, you add the shadow prefix and then one of the colors with its strength like this. And then if you want to, you can optionally add a slash with an opacity setting. So by default, the shadows would have 100% opacity. Here we're specifying 50% opacity with a /50. There's also a number of new modifiers. One of them is the right to left and left to right modifier, which is something that Bootstrap added, but you have to add a separate style sheet for that. Again, because of the JIT compiler, this is much easier to do with something like Tailwind. You just specify the difference of what would happen in a left to right layout versus a right to left layout. There's also new portrait and landscape modifiers. You just specify what happens when a device sits in a specific mode. There's also a print modifier so that you can define what your styles look like when they're printed. One of the interesting things about Tailwind is that when CSS releases a new feature, it's pretty good about adding that feature as a shortcut. So they've added a few new ways to style your form elements. So now we have access to file input types with the file prefix. And also you have now the accent color. So you have a little bit more control over how different things look like checkboxes. And so you can see when you go, for example, to accent colors, that all this is doing is using one of the new CSS properties like accent color and providing a shortcut. In the same way, since CSS added some scroll margin classes, you now get this scroll snap API, which means that when you scroll right here, it'll try to snap to a certain point. We create a container class and then another class to define how this item is aligned to that container. Just like bell bottoms, multi-column layouts are back in CSS. So once again, Tailwind just provides you some shortcuts to that as well. The interesting thing is that you can use it with the modifiers to have these appear at certain widths using the Tailwind CSS grid. One of my favorite new additions to CSS is the new aspect ratio property. So of course you have access to that with Tailwind as well. So there's now an easy way to play with Tailwind CSS, and that's by using the play CDN. So what you do is you add a script tag. Notice that it's not a link tag. So this isn't linking to a CSS document. It's linking to a piece of JavaScript that is going to analyze your page and then serve you up a version of Tailwind CSS that works with whatever is on your page. Now this means that you should not use this for production because every time you load the page, it's going to have to do that calculation. They've even added their own playground at play.tailwindcss.com. You can replace all this text right here or play with the example. And it's fully configurable, so it's not actually using the CDN. So if you come over here, you can see that it has the prefixes. This is how you import the library in a normal build process. And it even has access to the config file. Over here, you can change the layout, and you can also turn on dark mode. And this is sort of a mobile size option so that you can play around with the mobile size here. If you want to share your changes with somebody, let's change the color of this text right here. Then you can click this share button and it's going to create a link right here that you can share with somebody else. So that's every feature in Tailwind CSS 3. I really love it. Not a lot of changes, especially if you came from Tailwind CSS 2.1. You're already used to the JIT compiler, but they just made everything nicer. And what you're going to see with Tailwind is they're constantly adding any new CSS feature that releases gets added as a shortcut class. The huge advantage is that you have access to all the modifiers. So you can do things, whenever you hover, whenever a certain size of the, a display, is available. So those are what makes this framework really amazing, and one of the things that I love. So let me see if there's any other comments. So Peter is one of the regulars to the episodes. So don't worry, there's no such thing as being tardy to these. Just show up whenever and watch the replay later. So yeah, Rust is really awesome. It's just popped up in almost like every new tool that I see. They are moving pieces of it into Rust. Not the whole thing, but moving pieces of it just because it's so much more performant. And so that, I think, is a trend. If you're into that, then it's definitely something that you may want to look into learning as well. And we do have a course on Rust. So let's see. Oh, so there is. Oh, so Jeremy actually has somebody has an essential training course on Rust. So he's giving us the link right here. So Peter, of course, yeah. So this is actually my Q&A time. Thank you for watching, but you can ask questions. And as I mentioned, let me close out by saying that I really want to make this toolbox sort of a thing that helps everyone learn something not too huge every week, and sort of try to show you the trends and hopefully what is happening that you should know about in the industry. So let's see, other questions. Yeah, absolutely, Peter. Please ask away. That's what I'm here for. What are my thoughts on Next.js? So the world of the web is changing. I think that Next.js is a fine technology, but I think there's a lot of things that are trying to replace it. So I think it's definitely something that you should explore, but look at some of the other options as well. Should I spend a long time before? Yeah, I think that you should be really comfortable with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Learn one of the frameworks, possibly React. If you want something simpler, Vue.js. If you want something even simpler, not Assembler. So one of the other frameworks that I talked about, not Hydrogen, I am losing my mind. Alpine, is really easy to use. But if you want to be marketable, eventually you're going to have to learn React. Once you learn one of them, going between React and Vue is cake, super easy. So I would say get really good at the basics and then move on to one of these frameworks just to be marketable. So yeah, definitely spend your time on HTML and CSS. And then move on to other things. So if you had to make a 7-day weather multi-line chart, how would you do it? Definitely with React. I mean, one of the things that I do like about React and Vue are the way that they allow you to have access to like animation properties. It makes building that kind of sort of interactive app super easy. So, multi-line chart, I think that I would try to approach one of the frameworks that do the charting already. So I wouldn't try to build all that myself. Maybe I would look into some of the frameworks, and I'll look some up and I'll send you some links, Peter, later on. But yeah, I would probably definitely take advantage of how Vue gives you access, and React, of course, give you access to some of the properties that make things animatable or make things more dynamic when things are loading. So Jeremy had to jump off. No big deal. Everything's recording. Thank you for coming. Also, I lost Dewana, so probably lost a few people. Should I spend a long time? Yeah. So yeah, and so yeah, this pretty much. What do you call it? It's pretty much what I feel like. Thank you so much for watching this past year. I hope I can make it super awesome and interesting this coming year. Yeah, thank you for all the comments. What a great, I do this, I don't know, I really appreciate it when people take the time to, out of their busy day to like spend some time with me. Hopefully we can do this every week and learn a little bit every week. Let me know what you want to learn. I'm going to try, I have a list of frameworks that I want to try. So at the beginning of the year, I'm going to sort of catch up with a lot of frameworks. So I want to do like maybe Remix, and I already did Astro a little bit. I wanted to bring in Tailwinds because it just updated, but I want to do Next JS, Vue. I don't know. There's a lot of cool stuff like Isles and Vuetify and Slinkity. I have a long, huge list. So I'm going to pare it down, try to approach some frameworks. And then also I want to bring in some specific like CSS tips and as well as JavaScript tips that I think you should know about. So a lot of the stuff that I talked about, that's sort of my plan for the toolbox, showing you some demos, giving you some code that you can play around with, and hopefully helping you learn new things. So yeah, yeah, Peter's mentioning D3. That's probably what I would try to go with. But yeah, maybe there isn't. Yeah, I'll take a look at what's available. I know that there's a lot of other libraries that you can use. The D3, that thing is a bear. There's another one called, I don't know if you've seen C3, which tries to make it a little bit simpler. So I love that one, but I don't know if it has any advantages if you're using React. And you want to use that for that feature. I don't know if that would make it a lot easier. So thank you. Yeah, appreciate the nice comments. I am around. If you want to know anything, just contact me on LinkedIn. And thanks for watching again. It's my pleasure and really exciting to get this thing going this year.